In this episode, we're going to look at starting to get that front subframe mounted and where we're going to have to put the mounts and how we're going to cut and weld them in. And we're also going to start taking a look at how we're actually going to get the engine mounted and what kind of hole we need to cut in the bulkhead to do that. So the first thing to do really when thinking about mounting this subframe is getting the location of it correct, because we have to get the forward and backwards location correct to get the wheels in the middle of the wheel arches. Not so much of a problem at the back, because I knew I was going to kind of reshape the wheel arches anyway, but at the front it's obviously quite important because that's the steering wheels. So I know what has to go because we know that we got a gearbox tunnel to put through here as well. I'm going to have to remove all of the tunnel where the hydrogas suspension units sit and where also the lower arms mount. So I'm going to take and cut out all of that section to start with. It's like almost like one big panel on the bulkhead. I'm going to try and cut all that out as neatly as possible, and then I'll be able to put the subframe back in at a closer location to where it finally wants to be, and then see how much more cutting to do. So yeah, first thing to do is just get the grinder out and do a load of cutting. Right, so I've got all this front section cut out now. It looks quite a lot different, and there was a lot of material to move. It's all really kind of thick stuff. This is probably where like the most structure in the car is, because you've got the weight of the engine, and obviously it's the wheels that do the driving and the turning at the front. So there's a lot of strength in here, but it had to go to get the subframe in the correct position, front to back, and height-wise. And so now you can see what I'm talking about when I mentioned in the last episode about the subframe being so nicely sized to fit inside the Princess engine bay. So the two mounts, front and back, are half an inch away from just slipping inside the chassis rails. And so with the subframe at the height it is there, it wants to come up about 2 more inches, about another 50 mil. It's roughly in the correct position front to back. Again, I'm just measuring things to the inch at the minute, not to the millimetre or to the eighth, just because I want to try and get a feeling of how it is going to fit in here. But now that I've popped the subframe under, I can see, concentrating on these back mounts first, what I'm going to do is, because there was a lot of strength here, so I know when I remove this piece, there's really nothing to kind of carry the weight of all of this chassis rail going forward. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to weld a piece of 3mm plate in behind, because it's nice and flat on the back there, but I'll leave a gap up to about here, and then I can cut this section out both sides, and that'll allow that mount to come up the 50mm it needs, and then I can drop some brackets down off of that to mount onto here. So that's going to be fairly easy. And then when it comes to the front, what I need to do here is I'm going to have to cut into the chassis leg a little bit, so I can do a demonstration in the dirt, I think. So I'm going to make a cut. There we go. I'm going to make a cut front and back like that and remove all of that section. So I'll notch it essentially, and then I'll put some 3mm plate in as like a little C section, weld it all up, and that will allow the subframe to come up as high as it needs. And again, we can just set the whole subframe nice and level and straight and weld some brackets off, triangulate them a little bit. Honestly, I can't tell you how well this thing's working out. There's still a few more challenges to overcome. So one of them is that the radiator fits in the front fine. We'll show that later, how the radiator fits in on the stock mounts on the subframe really nicely. There's loads of room in front of it for an intercooler, which is handy because obviously we're going to put a blower on. The main problem is going to be cutting out the bulkhead. So the engine, really, the engine mounts are about halfway down the engine block, and the engine mounts are here. So we've got about half of the engine to cut into the bulkhead and the gearbox. So I'm inevitably going to have to strip out all the dashboard and stuff from the inside. I was going to have to do that anyway, but I think I'm going to end up with a fairly remodeled interior, which is not really what I wanted, but considering how easy or how well the back end has gone together and how well I can see this coming together, honestly I can live with that. Just having to kind of put a big tunnel in the bulkhead, that's fine. I've no problem with that. So, like I say, first thing really is to get the inner wings cleaned up on the outsides so that I can weld those bits of 3mm plate in, and then I can chop out the bottom section and allow those mounts to come up. And then, like I say, also cut out the front and notch the chassis legs to allow the whole subframe to come up. Okay, so I've cut out the chassis leg and welded those plates in at the back, and you can now see this is about, again, very roughly, a lot closer than before though, the height and level the subframe's going to sit at. So my plan now is to fill in these gaps here with some steel to kind of create like a C-section in there, weld all that up, grind it all back, and then in between there, there'll be a piece that comes out with a hole in it to take the subframe mount, and I'll do that basically in all four corners. There'll be another piece that comes out at the back, there and there, to take these mounts. Now the only thing I have to bear in mind is the holes in the subframe are quite big, so I mean, I guess it's to aid a little bit of adjustability on the subframe. I don't really want that. I'd rather engineer it so that it is in the correct position. I'm not doing a production line of cars like Jaguar were. So I can kind of measure it millimetre perfect, assuming that the car is millimetre perfect. And obviously, this is a 1981 Austin Princess. And they weren't necessarily known for being built millimetre perfect. So it's going to be close enough for what we want, I guess. So yeah, now it's okay. So cutting a bit more steel out, welding in those C-section pieces into the chassis leg, then getting some more pieces cut, getting them tacked in with the subframe perfectly level. This is where I need to, I need to get it spot on, get those pieces welded in, and then the subframe just bolts directly up to it. Easy as that. Right, so I've got these two bits of plate tacked in at the back of the front subframe mounts now. That's the easiest one to do because it's going straight onto the bits of plate that I've already squared up and welded nice and true onto the inside of the chassis legs. Of course, I'm not going to leave them like this. There will be some gussets on them as well. But for now, I just want to get some real decent tacks on so that I can still leaves me a bit of room to adjust them to get them, perfectly level. And parallel with each other. Once I've done that and I've got them level, I can add those gussets in. But of course I'm going to do the front mounts as well first. Probably drill some holes in them, bolt the subframe up, make sure everything's absolutely as close as it can be. Then, with the subframe in, I'll actually weld all the gussets on, because bolting the subframe in will actually give me a strengthener to stop any distortion as I do weld it. Again, getting the subframe in the correct position is probably the most crucial part. If you don't, are the wheels going to be in the middle of the car? Are they going to match up with the wheels at the back of the car? It has to be right. So it's better to take the time now. So we'll get those holes drilled in it, get the subframe bolted up, and then we can add in all the strength using the subframe as our jig essentially. So I've got all those plates tacked in now, and I've marked out, like fairly painstakingly marked out, the center holes for the actual mounts. I've double triple checked everything, so it looks like it's going to be good. What I'll do now is I will drill the holes, bolt the subframe in, take my trolley jack away. I'm going to have to trim one of these bits of steel down because the radiator mounts, it's a bit long, so I'll have to trim these down on both sides just to allow me to again fit the stock radiator in. But obviously they're not finished. They obviously need a lot of reinforcements yet, which they will get, but we're just still at the kind of check everything fits stage, I guess. But one thing you can see now the subframe is in its what will be its final position is this is where the engine mounts are, and there's about 4 inch of engine mount and then the engine, and of course the bulkhead's here. So there's a fairly large cut we've got to make, you know, this kind of size going that way, by that much. So it's quite a lot of the inside of the car that needs to get chopped. I've not pulled the dashboard out yet, so I don't really know what room there is behind there. I can't imagine it's packed with gear. You know, these cars don't really tend to have anything in them other than, you know, the HLS had power steering. That was like the that was what it was sold on the high models. So yeah, hopefully there's quite a big void behind the dash, but I guess we'll find that out. So yeah, drill those and trim those brackets down, and we can bolt the subframe up. Right, all the holes are drilled and we've got the subframe bolted in. They all line up okay, you know, a little bit tight in a couple of holes, but the bolts have gone in and that's the most important thing. So now we can tighten all the subframe down and actually use it as a jig so that when we weld the engine mounts up, they don't kind of distort all over the place and then take all the hole centers out, because that can happen because we're welding them quite hot. It's quite thick steel. They can move around a bit. So this is the kind of easy way of making sure that that's not going to happen. And then also, while we do that, we're going to like add in some gussets into those mounts to, you know, to make them stronger. This is, as like I've said, the strongest area of the car, but considering it's now going to take the stresses and strains of all the steering geometry and steering input and the engine itself, and the engine's going to be running quite a lot of power, we need to make sure this is solid. There's obviously still a lot of steel to go in here as well. We've got all that bulkhead to chop out, and in chopping out that bulkhead, we will tie it into those rear subframe mounts. And then, as I've said in previous episode, we're going to run a set of chassis legs front to back. So picking up from those front of the rear subframe mounts, they'll come right forward. We'll incorporate some jacking points into there. We'll incorporate the gearbox rear mount into there as well. So we can really add in quite a lot of strength, but we're going to have to do all of that later on because we've still got quite a bit of the car to chop out yet. Don't want to get carried away chopping bits of the car out until we've added some strength in. You know, for every bit we chop out, we need to add some more stuff in. So once we've got this subframe bolted in and fully welded in and gusseted, that's actually added quite a lot of strength to the front of the car. So like I say, next thing to do is to get those engine mounts welded up and start adding some gussets in and getting them tidied up a little bit. Right, so we've got those subframe mounts good enough for now, good enough that we can continue on. Like I say, Everything I'm doing at this point is all semi-temporary and will require more work. Just don't want people in the comments to get carried away thinking things aren't going to be strong enough and stuff like that, because there's a lot of steel to put in here yet. But we're trying to make progress in terms of like getting the car on its wheels, because I always tend to think the faster you make progress in that way, the easier it is to stay motivated, rather than trying to plugging away at the same old bit for ages and not feeling like you're getting anywhere. But now that we've got the subframe in, I've popped the standard radiator and fan in its mounts, and it mounts into the subframe, which is handy because that's one less thing to do. Obviously it needs some mounts at the top, but as you can see, this is one of the advantages of using a lot of OE parts off of the Jag. It fits in perfect. All we're going to have to do is make some mounts off of the front panel, and we've got stacks of room in front for an intercooler and potentially an aircon condenser. If we wanted, we could use the stock Jaguar aircon condenser. So that's nice. It clears this front cross member, which is ideal because again it's less chopping. We can keep more of the car original, which is what we want. But the next thing to start looking at really is the strut tops, just like we did on the back. So we roughly know where they're going to come through. I've had a bit of a measure, and I think the neatest way of doing this, because of how high up the A-arm mounts, the upper A-arm in the inner wing or in the wheel arch, it actually mounts right more or less on top of the wheel. So it's really high up. It's probably going to be in this kind of position. So we're going to have to totally remodel this inner arch anyway, or this inner wing, which I was, again, anticipating to have to do. It's part and parcel of doing a full transmission swap on a car. You know, you're going to have to make quite a lot of mounts for a lot of suspension components. But it does also give us an opportunity to add more steel in, add more strength in where we need it. So because I know this A-arm mount is going to be parallel with the ball joint at the bottom, I know it's roughly going to sit about here because I can just kind of line it through with the one down there. So I know it's going to sit about there, and that also means I know where the strut top comes out. So I know the strut top comes out in the middle of here. Now obviously it's probably more like out here. So the strut top I know comes in through about here. And like I say, instead of trying to cut a nice hole in there, knowing that we're still going to have to chop more of this inner wing out for these mounts to go onto, I'm going to cut this whole inner wing out. Well, or I'm going to cut it out so as far as so that I can do it neatly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trace about an inch inside this structural member here. Again, to try and retain some of the original strength in the car, I'm going to cut about an inch all the way around, and then probably up here, something like that, and then across. And by cutting all that out, it allows me to A, pop the strut straight through. I've not got to worry about trying to cut my circle out in the correct position, and it allows us to recreate the positions for the upper A-arm, no problem. So again, I'm going to need jigs making off the Jag, exactly the same as I did at the back. These are probably going to be a bit trickier to fit because the subframe sits quite a lot higher in the chassis rails. That's why I had to notch it than it does in the Jag. So I'm going to have to be a bit clever about how I make the jigs, but it can be done. It's just going to be a bit more time consuming. So making some jigs and cutting out these inner wings basically. Right, so I've got my jig off of the Jag. Again, it looks a bit scruffy, but with these kinds of things, it's always just about making it quickly and accurately. It doesn't need to look pretty. You know, it only needs to be accurate. So I've already had to hack a little bit out of it, which I kind of anticipated, to get it to fit into the Princess. But this is where you can see where the strut top is, and you can see I come through that hole nicely. Giggity. But this simulates the upper arm mounts. So we've got this one and this one. They're both for the upper arm. And this one is fouling on the wing here, the inner wing. So it's a bit difficult to hold it in position because it doesn't actually fit in position. But it wants to go there, apart from angled more inboard. It can't because this mount on the other side, that you can't see, that's hidden behind here, is hitting on the inner wing. So I've got no choice but to chop more of this inner wing out. I didn't really want to do that because as soon as you start cutting into the chassis member here, like this more structural triangulation, it starts to get quite hard to make it look untouched. But we've got no choice. So it's just going to be a case of cutting more out now until we get to a nice, neat-ish hole that this jig fits into. Right, so we've managed to get the jig in now. I've cut out quite a lot more than I would have hoped. And this isn't quite working out as nice as I hoped it would. It's gone really well so far, this project. So I was anticipating to have some problems at some point, and we're now coming across those problems. So to demonstrate, really, we've got the jig bolted in place. Ignore the fact I've cut a bit too much out the wing. We'll gloss over that. I've had to cut out a bit more than I'd like, and we still need to cut more. See, this which replicates the strut is 2.5 inches in diameter, and the actual strut itself, more or less the widest point of the spring, really wants to be about 5 inches, and that gives us minimal clearance. We'd like a bit more, and really that means we're going to have to cut around this point here. I'll just mark a line in the dirt like Simba. That's pretty much where we would need to cut to get clearance through for the strut. So obviously it doesn't leave a lot of this chassis leg left, and the chassis leg is where we're mounting the subframe. So before I get carried away cutting any more out and trying to plan around how we can keep these chassis legs, we might need to start thinking about getting rid of them, or at least replacing them. But we've also got quite a lot of bulkhead cutting to do. So we've got to cut quite a lot of the bulkhead out, and I'm at the point where I think I always like to not cut out too much before you put too much back. But if we've got to cut quite a lot of the bulkhead out, we've still got to neaten up all of this where the Hydra gas suspension was mounted. Obviously, we can't leave it like that. It all needs neatening up. And we needed to tie these into the bulkhead and chassis legs as well. What we're probably going to end up doing is cutting out the bulkhead enough to get the engine in. So we'll put the subframe back in, we'll cut out enough to get the engine in, which means I've got to strip the dashboard and stuff out of the car, which I was going to have to do anyway. So we'll get that all stripped out, we'll get the subframe in, we'll cut out enough of the bulkhead to get the engine in, and then we'll see what we've got left of the bulkhead, and then we can see about whether and how we're going to basically replace these chassis legs with something that is going to be something that's going to give us the clearance. Because we could add material on the inside here, no problem. Because we're going to cut it out, you know, we could add in a section like this which ties onto the bulkhead, but we don't know how far out we're going to have to cut that bulkhead yet either. How low and how high, I've got a feeling it's going to be pretty high. So given that we've still got some fairly strong subframe mounts, I'm going to go for putting the subframe back in, chopping the bulkhead out as much as we need to get the engine in, and then trying to make an assessment from there, really. Right, I've managed to get the dash out enough. I don't want to take all the dashboard out, so it's got loads of cables and stuff, and electronics on these are super temperamental as it is. I don't really want to go and unplug in things unless I have to. So I've got that out and crucially managed to get the insulation out and the heater. They were what I needed because I knew if I cut straight through that, I'm just going to cut straight into the insulation and straight into the heater and wreck it. I'm not going to be able to use that heater anyway because of where the gearbox tunnel is going to go, but I still don't want to damage it because that can go into another Princess. So the engine is roughly 600 millimeters wide, and so that means I need to cut, if this is my center line here, again I'll just scribe a center line in the dirt, I need to cut more or less straight across the top of the bulkhead, 300 millimeters wide either side, which is going to take out the clutch mount, and then the screen wash mount basically straight down, and I'm going to just chop that whole lot out. Again, I know it's not necessarily the neatest way of doing it, but I'm at the point now where we've cut so much out the inner wings, there's a good chance we might end up removing all of the bulkhead just to be able to do the job neatly and to fit those new chassis rails. So it's just a case of get cutting, get the subframe back up, get the engine in, which might take quite a lot to cut in. Yeah, and go from there, I guess. Right, engine is in. So we've cut the bulkhead out and I've dropped the engine in as close as I can get it. I took the gearbox off first, like I said, because there's no need to try and put it in with the gearbox. It's a lot more awkward and I won't be able to get it in with the gearbox on because I'll need to cut the floor out. Don't want to cut the floor out until I know exactly how much I need to cut out because it's going to be a lot harder to get. Look, I don't want to end up with just loads of holes in the car. I want to try and assemble as much of the car as possible with the fewest amount of holes. But what I've more or less established from getting the engine in this far, it needs to go another 6 inches further back. I can't get it another 6 inches further back without dropping the engine down. I can't really drop the engine down because the front of the sump is on the subframe. The S-Type, specifically the S-Type engine, has like a really weird oil reservoir on the front of the sump which sticks right out. I know you can change it to the ST220 one and the X-Type one, and probably no, I'd imagine the XJ one's probably the same actually. So I might do that. I will need the extra oil capacity from somewhere though. It'll aid getting the engine in and out. I might just take sump off for now actually. But other than that, it's pretty close. I know the engine will come down a bit more, but it needs to go further back. It can't go further back because, as I suspected, I am going to have to cut the bulkhead right up to where the bonnet shuts. Now that gives me a bit of a problem because under here is the air intakes for the heater, and as soon as I start cutting into that, again I lose all the kind of windscreen support. It's going to start getting a bit messy, really messier than I would have liked, but we are trying to shoehorn a fairly big engine. It's a big engine bay. The problem is in the Jag it fits really far back. So the engine mount here, which is in the middle of the engine, is actually like in line with the front wheel. So it is quite far back. It's going to give us tons of room at the front, but it's not ideal in terms of it's quite high up in the car. Again, the Jag isn't really built for low centre of gravity. It's not a sports car. So, and I definitely can't drop the engine down because if I do, that'll throw out all of the suspension geometry and I needn't have bothered starting out with the Jag subframes anyway, really, because that's the main reason I wanted to use the Jag subframes, just to keep it nice, keep it a nice car to drive without actually me having to work out any of that suspension geometry. So the next thing to do is to cut more out of the bulkhead here. I'm going to cut more out here, and I'm going to cut a bit further down into the floor because I can see the oil filter housing is going to hit next. The oil filter housing is like built in to the engine mount. It's really weird. I don't know why they've done it like that. Just for access, I guess. But yeah, the galleries actually come through the engine mount. It's quite weird. So yeah, I'm going to do that. Chop a bit more out the floor, and then chop this bulkhead right out. And then hopefully, yeah, the engine will drop in, and that'll tell us how much we need to cut out for the gearbox and what I want to do about these chassis legs. So next thing really is to start cutting out some more of the bulkhead. But because it's that upper scuttle panel area, I need to spend a bit of time measuring it out, just to try and make sure we're not cutting out any more than we need to. But yeah, I'm really enjoying doing this. It's a project that I've wanted to do for a while, and all your comments and just general enthusiasm that I'm getting from people in the comment section is really nice. It helps keep me motivated to keep pressing on with it. So yeah, thanks for watching.